against 135,000. And what was the purpose of God doing that? Yeah. To show that God is the one that delivered them, right? Not themselves. And they needed to see that, don't they? Why?
Because they constantly hiding him and constantly turning away.
Exactly. The book of Judges is that cycle. And we're in this cycle again. They have left God. They have forgot about God. They have turned their backs on God. And as we talked about, their oppressions keep getting worse and worse for them. And at this point, this oppression with the Midianites was so severe, it was even, some of the wording was used in describing the time that they were in Egypt being oppressed. And so this oppression keeps getting worse. They're not learning their lesson. And so here we're going to see God's power displayed in this battle. And so that gets us down to verse 7. Let's see. Judges 7 and verse 7. Well, we'll go back to verse 6. It says, and the number of those who laughed, putting their hands to their mouth, was 300 men, but all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. I think we finished talking about that in the sense of the ones that were laughing like a dog. They're not watchful, are they? And the ones that would dip their hand and pick up the water, they're able to watch. And so there's some significance to that. And so, verse 7 then, it says, and the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who laughed, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. So the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands. And he sent away all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. And so we have now down to 300. And notice what God says in verse 7. What's significant there? Verse 7.
I will save you and deliver the Midianites in your hand.
I will save you. It was not them. It was not by their own power. It's not by their own savviness in fighting battles and the ability to take on this massive army. It was God. God says, I will save you. That's happened a lot. Many times that has been stated. When we think about Deborah, we talk about Deborah. She told Barak that God was going to deliver them. Every time God was there to deliver them, which fits within the analogy that we use here, because the cycle. You have the cycle of them being put into oppression because of their sin, that they come out of that bondage because God delivers them, He sends a deliverer. The same is for us today, right? We can't do it on our own, can we? Can we save ourselves? Can we get our sin removed by ourselves? No, we need God. And so God, through Christ, is that Redeemer. And so He says, I will save you. And most people, that goes against the reasoning, right? Why would 300 go against 135,000? Human reasoning says, no, that doesn't work. But when God's on their side, they're going to win. And I think of, when you think about that reasoning, think about 1 Corinthians chapter 1, where Paul talks about the foolishness of preaching, save those that believe. The idea there is the fact that, to the Greeks, the fact that God could die on a cross does not make sense to them. The idea of going down into the water of baptism to people thinks, well, that doesn't make sense. I can think of a better way of doing this. But it's simple. The gospel is simple, and God has laid it out for us, and what we need to do. And so, notice then verse 8. He sends them away, those that were fearful and those who were afraid. And the 300 that was left, they took a trumpet and their food, and they followed Gideon. So that brings us to verse 9. It says, and it happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant. And you shall hear what they say. And afterward toward your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. And he went down with Purah, his servant, to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. I think it's interesting. Gideon has already asked God twice to prove that this is from him, that this is what he needs to do. Gideon doesn't ask here, does he? God says, if you are still doubtful, if you are still afraid to do this, go down to the camp and you're going to not be afraid anymore. And I think that's interesting because Gideon, since the beginning, God has told him you are a powerful man, in a sense, what was the word he used? A man of valor, a mighty man of valor. At that point, Gideon hadn't done anything. And so, to him, he doesn't know that. He doesn't know what he's capable of doing. He doesn't know the leader that he's going to be, just like Moses. And so God here knows his heart, knows what's going on. He's saying, if you're afraid, go down, I'm going to show you. You shouldn't be afraid. And so he does. And Gideon takes that opportunity to confirm what God had told him. And so, what is God doing here with Gideon?
Notice he didn't chide Gideon for being afraid.
Nope.
So,
Not once. Not once. Yeah. It's a good point because he didn't say, you can't do that, you shouldn't be that way. No, he helped him to gain that strength. And I think that's the key to what's going on here, is God's building up his confidence, his strength to be able to do this, for sure. And so, was it wrong for Gideon to have some fear? I don't think so. Because is it scary to be in that situation? You think about being in his position. You have 300 men. You can see the massive army that's out there. It's already talked about how this army is so big. It's like locusts. Their army is so big, you can't even see the ends of it. And he's seen that. Be in his position and go, how is this 300 men going to do this? And human reasoning, that doesn't work. And yet, God's telling him, don't be afraid. And so I don't think it's wrong at all. Sometimes it's, what can fear do for us, though, sometimes?
build our faith once we're over it.
Yeah, build our faith, exactly. Yeah.
Cripple us to not do things we should do.
Okay, so in the bad, it can cripple us, yes. What can it do for us good-wise?
Oh, sorry.
He can be a motivating factor.
Okay, motivating us. Can it also help put perspective, help us stay focused on what we need to do? Yeah, I think so. When we were in Memphis, Foundations had, I work with the boys, and the boys are preparing their classes or their lessons to do, and some of them are afraid to do that. So that's not bad, because fear sometimes will help you to make sure that you have studied, make sure that you're prepared, make sure that you're doing the right thing. Because a person that's not nervous or anything, they may just get up and start talking and using their own wisdom and not caring that the fact that they need to be speaking what God says. And so that's not wrong. And I think what Gideon had here was not wrong. His fear helped him to rely on who? God. And so fear's not always bad. It can be a good thing for us also. And so then verse 12 says, now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts. And their camels were without number, as the sand by the sea and multitude. All right, so he hadn't said that already. I'm thinking ahead, but yes, it stated here how numerous this army is. It's massive. And so then, verse 13, it says, and when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. He said, I've had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed. Then his companion answered and said, this is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. That's pretty impressive to hear, isn't it? Who are these Midianites? Are they followers of God? No. Are they, they are, as we talked about, a distant relation to the Jews, to the Hebrew people here. But it's pretty impressive for them to have said this. And so that dream, of course, the dream the man had, he didn't really fully understand, but the other man said, that's Gideon. What does that say about the army? What's on their mind? They're worried that they're going to lose. They're scared. Who do you think put that fear there? God did.
They possibly knew the history of God from battles in the past.
Yeah. This has happened before. So read Joshua 2, verse 8 through 13. Joshua chapter 2, verse 8 through 13.
And before they were laid down, she came up unto them upon the road. And she said unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, when you came out of Egypt, and what you did unto the two kings of the Amorites, that were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. And as soon as we had heard these things, our hearts did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God, in heaven above and in earth beneath. Now therefore, I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, that ye will also show kindness unto my father's house, and give me a true token, and that ye will save alive my father and my mother and my brother and my sisters and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death.
So who is it talking there?
Rahab.
Rahab, right? And so as they're coming into the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan at that time, here Jericho is a fortified city, and they should feel fairly safe in a city like that. And the spies go in, Rahab says, we've already heard. We've heard about what God has done for you guys. They're a Gentile nation. They don't know God. But they have heard that the God of Israel, the God of the Hebrew people, has done all of these amazing things. And so the thought of this massive fortress that they're in really doesn't seem like a massive fortress anymore. They're scared. So they had fear. And so I think that's similar to what's going on here in Judges, is that the people, the men of this army, yes, they're this massive army that they feel like they should be able to conquer anything, but yet they're scared of Gideon. And so, and notice the man even says in that verse, it says, Gideon, the son of Joash, the man of Israel, into his hand, God has delivered Midian and the whole camp. He already knew. In their minds, what happens to a sports team that goes into their battle, not battle, but their game, with the defeat on their mind? They lose. They've already defeated themselves in their mind. They're not going to win. That's exactly what's going on here. They're going into this battle with this thought, we're going to die, we're going to lose. And so that fear, all that's going on, and then of course what happens, I think, plays into that. And so, did God have a part in that? Yes, fully believe that. God had a part in what happened to Joshua also. And so notice verse 15 now. And so it was when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and his interpretation that he worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand. Gideon is not scared anymore. Gideon is fully confident in what God was going to do. He heard this conversation, he was strengthened, and not even that, he even worshiped God. And so Gideon was, he knew. He knew that that God was with him. He was now confident. And so notice verse 16. says, then he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise, watch. And when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Why did he say that? Why did he say that phrase? You say this, the Lord, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon.
So they knew who they
Yeah.
was conquering.
They knew he was conquering it. Does that also kind of play back to what he heard in the camp? It said the sword of Gideon and then of the Lord. And so I think it's good what Gideon says here. He says first mention God, say the sword of God, but also of Gideon. I think it's playing upon that fear that he heard in that man's voice. And so he divides his army into 3 companies, 100 each. They go and they surround the camp, and so they were to follow the lead of Gideon here. And so notice then, let's see my notes here. I have a comment here by Knox. It says, in those times, the movement of armies was controlled by trumpet blasts. Commands were given by blowing different notes on the trumpet. Commands to advance, retreat, or whatever. This form of communication allowed large armies to maneuver in an effective and efficient manner. 300 trumpets would signify a large army. Thus, one sees the terror brought into the Midianites when they heard these trumpets blow all around them. And so, trumpets are used in battles during that time. We even see that in some of our history in America, trumpets being used. But to have 300 trumpets to them means a massive army is there. They don't know it's only 300. And so then verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outpost of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just as they had posted the watch, and they blew the trumpet and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. And so first Gideon's company is with him. They approach the camp. Now it says at the beginning of the middle watch. So Knox states that there's different, I'm not going to read all that, but there's different periods of time of watches, but this would have been between the 10 and 2 a.m. And so not only was it during the beginning of the middle watch, but that would have been when the guards would have been changing. So there would have been kind of not a confusion, but a time of, okay, hey, this person's coming in, I need to get ready. They're not really paying attention, right? And so it would have played on that also. And so then verse 20, it says, then the 3 companies, after they had broke their pitchers and blew their trumpets, then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers. They held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands were blowing, and they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And every man stood in his place all around the camp, and the whole army ran and cried out and fled. And when the 300 blew their trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his company throughout the whole camp, and the army fled to Beth-Achaia toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel-Meholah by Tabeth. And so this happens. They break their jars. What would have been going on between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. for most people? Most people are sleeping, right? So the army is asleep. They're not prepared, right? They're not going to have their armor on. They're not going to be watchful. They're going to be enjoying sleep. And so to have these trumpets then start blaring and the yelling that's going on, it's going to cause a lot of confusion. It's going to cause a lot of anxiety for the people in this army that had been sleeping. And so they're undressed, they're ready to fight. And so there was confusion, and it was dark. And if you wake up and you come out of your tent, and you look around and there's these torches all around you, and these trumpets are blaring like crazy, in your mind you think there's this massive army. And that's exactly what God wanted. That's exactly what Gideon was trying to get to here. And so what happens is the Lord, verse 22, set every man's sword against his company. What's that mean?
They fought
Or his
each other.
companion. Huh?
They fought each other.
They fought each other. So So then so they flee, verse 22. Verse 23, the men of Israel gathered together from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh and pursued the Midianites. And Gideon sent messengers throughout all the mountains of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites, and seize from them the watering places as far as Beth-Vera and Jordan. And then all the men of Ephraim gathered together and seized the watering places as far as Beth-Vera and the Jordan. Why are they seizing the water places? Yeah. As we're going to see in chapter 8, Gideon and his army is very exhausted by this point. This army is running for their lives. They're going to try to stop anywhere they can to get water, food, whatever, to provide themselves. They can't. And so really, when you look at this, he's telling all of these nations, as we talked about, Midian was over here, in this area. And so, of course, we have Gad, I think Asher, and the half tribe of Manasseh is on this side of the Jordan. And so they're fighting over here. The Midianites have come across the Jordan River. They're fighting over here. They're trying to get back. And so by calling for Naphtali and all of the nations that he did, he's basically trying to close the border around them and keep them from fleeing, for them to not get out, and to defeat the whole army. And by also seizing the watering places. And so then verse 25 says, and they captured two princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and Zeb they killed at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued Midian and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon on the other side of the Jordan. And so Oreb and Zeb, Oreb means raven, Zeb means wolf. I'm guessing these places were named that after they were killed there. It wasn't a coincidence that, hey, this is the place where Zeb's from. No. I'm guessing they named them after that. But they brought the heads to Gideon. Why? Yeah, to prove that they were dead, right? To prove that they had defeated them there. And so, as we end chapter 7, the army is still fleeing. As we get to chapter 8, we're going to find that part of the army continues on, and they get out. And they cross the Jordan, and they're trying to get back home, and Gideon is chasing them. So any questions or comments on chapter 7? Nothing? All right, so you should have another handout. Chapter 8. And let's do some reading here. So we want to read verse, decide where we go. Let's read verse 1 through verse 5. Someone want to read that?
And now the men of Ephraim said to him, why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight with the Midianites? And they reprimanded him sharply. So he said to them, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger toward him subsided when he said that. When Gideon came to the Jordan, he and 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted but still in pursuit. Then they said to the men of Succoth, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian.
All right, so chapter 8, we have Ephraim. Now Ephraim, they're jealous. Okay, Ephraim says, well, why didn't you call us to fight? Why did you call the other nations around to fight? And so, verse 1, it says they reprimanded him sharply. They were mad, and they're yelling, reprimanded. You can say yelling or sternly aggravated with him because why didn't you include us? Now, the thing about Ephraim, so you can see that there's some kind of turmoil between Ephraim and the rest of at least Judah at that time. And so, Ephraim in time is going to become that prominent nation. It's going to be really Samaria in time. That's going to have a lot of kings from Ahab is one, and many others. And so Ephraim here, they're upset. And so how does Gideon then react to that? Well, in the King James, it uses the word chide. In the King James says reprimand. But it means just really to complain, contend, debate. Were they mad because they didn't fight, or they maybe feel guilty that they didn't try to jump in and help?
I think they wanted to be part of the glory.
Yeah, I think so too. They could have felt some guilt because they should have been there, didn't have to be asked, because they're being oppressed too. But I think a big part of it's the glory because of what they're going to be later. A lot of kings coming from Ephraim. And so, notice verse 2 then. And so how does he answer? He says, well, what have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God has delivered into your hands the prince of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. And what was I able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger toward him was subsided. What does that sound like Gideon's doing? Huh? A little humble, a little dumb. Yeah. Yeah. He's saying, you've had your part. You're an amazing nation. You're the nation that has the glorious grapes, Ephraim. They have a part of the real fertile ground. He's saying you've done a lot, and I'm nothing compared to you. He's flattering him in a sense, and it makes him feel better, right? Makes him feel, okay, we are important. So I'm going to read Proverbs 15, verse 1.
A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger.
What could have Gideon done there? He could have just yelled back. He could have got mad at them. He could have said, well, you should have been there. You should have had more part of this. You've been oppressed too, but he didn't. He gave them a soft answer, as Proverbs 15:1 says. And he praised and encouraged them, really. And that ended the debate, ended the problem right there. It subsided their anger. And so we see that fearlessness of Gideon and his army. And we get to verse 3. It says in verse 4, sorry. It says, when Gideon had came to the Jordan, he and 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted but still in pursuit. So they've crossed over the Jordan now. Now everything else that we're going to see is now going to be on this side of the Jordan. So as you remember, Gad, I think Asher, and then I know the half tribe of Manasseh. I can't remember all the tribes. There were 3 tribes that were over here. They're on this side. We haven't really heard much out of them in the past. I think the last time we really hear much about them is when they go back in Joshua to their homes. And then the fight that had almost happened because they built an altar to try to remember the unity between them, which that's going to play a part here in a minute. And so we haven't really heard much about them from that point. And so also think about Midian is over in this area. Who do you think's been feeling the brunt of Midian's oppression? These people, these tribes. And so that's going to play a part also. And so verse 4, they're in pursuit still. Verse 5 says, then he said to the men of Succoth, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing Zebah and Zilmah, kings of Midian. And so we already talked about Oreb and Zeb were the 2 princes of Midian. Zebah and Zilmah were the 2 kings of Midian. And so these men had been fighting, but had not stopped yet. They were exhausted and hungry. Now the city of Succoth tribe of Israel. The people, the men of Sukkot here, are a part of the children of Israel. And they're saying here, no, we're not going to help you. Notice that in verse 6, it says, and the leaders of Sukkot said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army. They don't want to help them. And so, why is that the case? Why do you think that their own people didn't even want to help them?
Fear the repercussions. If the Midianites find out they helped them, and
Yeah.
they'll get extra hard.
I think it is fear. They felt the oppression the hardest because of where they're at. And I think in the question there, the first thing they said is the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand? What does that mean? Have you caught them yet? Because if you haven't caught them, that means they could come back and still oppress us even more if we help you. And so they're scared. They're God's people. They're one of the tribes, yet they're scared to help their own people because of the repercussions. They were not willing to do the right thing, even though it was the right thing, because of fear. Fear of man. Should they have known that God was on Gideon's side? I think so. And so, I think we're going to see that also with Penuel here in a minute. It's also another city in the tribe of Israel, and they were unwilling to help. And so notice Gideon's answer, verse 7. So Gideon said, for this cause, when the Lord has delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. That's pretty vivid, right, what he's going to do. He's pretty upset. But notice what he says here, when the Lord has delivered. What is Gideon's confidence here?
That you'll get it accomplished.
He's going to win. What he's going to do is going to be accomplished because God's on his side. And so he is telling them, this is a sure thing. When I'm done, I am coming back to you. Beware. And so he didn't have any doubt anymore of what God was capable of doing and what God's intentions were with him. He knew what was going to happen. And so he promised that he was going to come back. And so what he says here, that he's going to use, I know we're almost out of time, but he says here, we're going to use thorns of the wilderness and with briars. Pulpit commentary had this interesting thought. It said the word here rendered tear means literally to thresh. Hence, some suppose that the punishment here spoken of was a severe kind of capital punishment inflicted by threshing instruments with sharp iron points called thorns of the wilderness and briars. And some think that it's literally thorns and briars. I really think it's the literal thorns and briars of the wilderness he's going to use to thresh them. I kind of think of the scourging of Christ, what the Romans used. They used sheep bone and pieces of metal that would tear the flesh when they whipped them. I think that's the picture that Gideon's given us here. He says, when I get back, I'm going to use these thorns and briars from the wilderness that I am walking through to get back to you, and I'm going to whip you. I'm going to deal capital punishment out on you for what you have done here. Pretty serious consequences, pretty fierce wording, but have they forgotten God? Have they turned their back on God? I think so. And so they're getting dealt their punishment for that. And so then verse 8